The music pedagogy in Serbian ecclesiastic and other schools during the 18th and 19th centuries was based mainly on church chanting. Preserved archive records testify that church chanting was obligatory in the school curriculum and was taught on a daily basis. Teachers and chanters were primarily priests and deacons, but also teachers specialized in other school subjects. The fact that knowledge of chanting was prerequisite for all teachers proves how significant church chanting was. Although great attention was being paid to the official collegiate curriculums, numerous records from the period affirmed that students' progress was rather poor, as well as the chanting practice itself. The causes were various, but they can be assigned mainly to one denominator: global historical circumstances, which were extremely complicated. During the burdensome period of Turkish absolutism, you can see the slide number 2. And especially before and after the two great migrations of Serbian people in 1690 and 1737 from their century-old herds from Kosovo and Metohija to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there have not been any favorable conditions to develop neither a chanting tradition nor any other kind of art. The fact that there are very few music manuscripts preserved and known argues that the chanters and teachers of chanting who could read music were very rare. Although in the new European homeland, Serbs had a direct contact with the ideas and artistic movements of the Enlightenment and rationalism, they have never abandoned their old heritage. With equal attention, they followed artistic ideals of the Russian Baroque, as well as the tendencies typical for post-Byzantine art, mainly from Mount Athos. Acquiring broad education at the Kiev Academy, but also at the Protestant universities in Europe, Halle and Leipzig, as well as in the so-called Slavic Latin schools situated on the territory of the so-called Metropolis of Sremski Karlovci, Serbian monks and citizens did not used to get engaged seriously in studying music for a long period of time. In recent history, there were many attempts to train Serbian chanters systematically on the basis of the late Byzantine pneumatic notation. Chanting schools, which were established on church dignitaries' initiatives, were guided primarily by Greek chanters from Mount Athos, Constantinople, and Thessalonica. During the 18th and the first decades of the 19th centuries, there were several chanting schools among the Serbs. Please, number 3 slide. Yes. The Greek teachers held most of them. In 1721, the Bishop of Belgrade and Karlovci, Mojsije Petrović, founded the school in which some Gerasim, priest Constantinos from Constantinople and Nicholas from Thessalonica taught their pupils. Slide number 4, please. From the 1729 to 1731, also in Belgrade, the second chanting school was organized by Bishop Vikentije Jovanović. On his invitation, the monk Anatolius from the monastery Vatopedi came with his assistant Deacon Joasaph. The Greek teacher Ananias from the Laver monastery had been teaching for 4 years in the eparchy of Bačka. There are no references as for where and when he was working. Another Greek daskalos, Georgios Spidas, was a master in the Greek Serbian school in Sremski Karlovci. At last, Dionysie Popović, Greek by origin and the Bishop of Buda, was the last one who tried to make the Serbian chanters learn pneumatic notation. He founded the chanting school in Buda at the beginning of the 19th century, and together with the Romanian monk Macarie, unsuccessfully attempted to publish the Anastasimatarion in the new method and Church Slavonic textual alignment. In addition, the ecclesiastic school in Sremski Karlovci, founded in 1794, had a significant place in forming the recent Serbian chanting tradition. Despite attempts to thoroughly learn chanting skills, to rely not only on what they learned from oral tradition rather than to sing according to neumes, the results in teaching chanters to read music still lagged. Just to mention that in Serbian monasteries of so-called Fruška Gora, the territory that was under jurisdiction of Serbian Metropolitan of Sremski Karlovci, two groups of different kind of chanting manuscripts from the 18th to 19th centuries have been preserved. There are several almost bilingual Greek and Church Slavonic anthologies written in the late Byzantine notation by unknown, probably Greek scriveners. Some of them you can see in following slides, number 5, slide number 5, yes, 6 and 7 slide, please. Yes. You can see on this one, on the left, it's Church Slavonic texts, church hymns, and on the right, it was a pneumatic collection of some liturgical hymns. Beside these musical manuscripts, there are a large group of manuscripts without any sort of musical notation, but which were for certain used in chanting practice. They seem to be used as a sort of musical anthologies as well, with all necessary hymns for main liturgical services. It is worth to point out that those manuscripts were written by chanters who were musically illiterate, but who had learned and knew the church melodies by heart. On slides 8, 7, and 10, please, Father Ambrosia, yes, you can see that those slides illustrate that chanters and at the same time the scriveners used to write texts of hymns, repeating parts of some words according with melismas of melody that they knew by heart. In this way, they had an opportunity to remember obviously the melismatic melody, which needed to be repeated many times to be memorized in a proper manner. And the last one slide from this section. Yes, you can see here many times repeated some parts of words, which means that they knew melody by heart, but not notation with which they can written down those melodies, melismatic melodies. Serbian chanters during the 19th century, however, used an extremely simplified form of mnemotechnic graphic notations, the so-called trile. The next slide, please. Yes, they were dashes written above liturgical texts, which used to mark ascending or descending melodic progression and duration of tones, but not their pitch, then beginning of melismas and cadences, stresses in declamation, or some other melodic details. Each chanter used to have his own rules of how to use them, which were supposed to remind him of what he had already known. In other words, experienced chanters who were capable of differentiating features of octoechos modes and knew the rich repertoire of melodies by heart used trile. However, to a beginner, this system of notation could not be of any use. On the contrary, according to a certain chanter's testimony from the 19th century, those who have very good ear hearing are capable of learning partially, but those whose ear hearing is not so good can hardly learn anything. Therefore, a young man who wants to become a teacher and does not know even the least necessary regarding church chanting gets the impression that this is difficult to learn and then becomes negligent toward this subject, loses willpower and avoids it. The advantage of the staff notation and evasion of hooks, as a certain author named trile, was emphasized by numerous chanters in the 19th century, especially by the first Serbian musicians whose education was based on European art music. The interest for staff notation emerged during the 30s and 40s of the 19th century, and it was directly connected with the introduction of the choral part singing in Serbian churches, which because of its musical notation was called notational, harmonious, and musical by chroniclers. The introduction of the church part singing, which caused different opinions of church dignitaries and believers, urged a more thoughtful attitude to the monophonic tradition of chanting. Slide number 12, yes. Cornelius Stankovic, a student of famous Austrian professor and composer of that time, Simon Sechter, was the first to implement frequent demands for recording traditional church hymns and thus to protect them from changing. This was in 1850s with blessing and patronage of Serbian Patriarch in Austria, next slide, Josif Rajačić. The tendencies to written down church melodies in European notation was kept until the middle of the 20th century by experienced Serbian chanters and teachers. Most of the Serbian collections of church melodies correspond to Greek anthologies and Russian obichod manuscripts. Nevertheless, the appearance of different notational collections of church melodies, which were printed in a rather modest number of copies and especially for educational reasons, did not methodologically advance the process of learning church melodies. On the contrary, just like the old theology students used to use hooks, the present ones are struggling with notes, the only difference being that the notes have replaced hooks, commented one of the observers of the circumstances of that period. With the rise of the number of teachers with a good knowledge of European musical notation and theory, more opportunities for systematic musical literacy were given to pupils. The ultimate goal of their lessons, where they used to learn notational signs, keys, source of scales, rhythm, tempo, etc., was to prepare them for taking part in choral singing, which could now be heard more often in larger cities during liturgies, especially on feast days. Monophonic church melodies, like many centuries ago, were still learned by ear and by heart. A teacher would sing a section of a hymn, melodic pattern, once or twice, as many times as necessary for the pupils to learn. Then another part and the rest until the entire song was put together. Students would only have the text in front of them, and they learned the melody by ear, just by listening to what their teacher sang. Memorizing entire lines of melodic patterns, the beginning and the end of which equal with the beginning and the end of columns verses, was the first task set for students to overcome. It was very important to remember the sequence according to which patterns were replacing one another. It was particularly important for the final pattern, which was considered to be the recognizable pattern of a mode. Slide number 14. Next slide, please. Once again, yes. The second phase, you can see here that there was very strict structure, the melodic pattern A, then the melodic pattern B, C, then the repeated melodic pattern A, slightly different from the first one, and B, and the final section at the end. So it was strict structure that was learned by heart, and the process was the following. The second phase was about adjusting the melodic patterns to a new text, which was called tailoring in the Serbian chanting tradition. Namely, melodic patterns which were learned had to be adjusted expanded or shortened according to the verses of liturgical hymns. How significant the parameter of melodic patterns was for Serbian chanters, one can conclude from the fact that it was stated as the main and often the only criteria on which the modes of the octoikos were differentiated among themselves. The scale-wise features of the church melodies did not used to be explained to the students. In other words, the Serbian chanters did not consider the scale-wise features of the church melodies to be characteristic for the ethos of modes. This is proved by the fact that they would sing modulating patterns automatically without connecting them with the characteristic words or verses. The lack of comprehensive theory about melodic, rhythmic, and metric parameters on which church chanting is based, as well as the whole octoikos system, caused that Serbian chanters inherited criteria for classification of melodies and their names without a critical approach. The rhythmical metric component of a melody had importance only in the general division on short or little and long or great chanting. This terminology was most probably adopted from the Russian chanting practice and is still in use. Short chanting is that in which each unvoiced syllable of the text is sung to one beat, and a voiced syllable may last two or more, the words flowing without any great drawing out of particular syllables. Long or great chant is that in which each syllable can be sung to a melody of several beats. Such division completely corresponded to the live musical practice, which was preserved in Serbian churches by the end of the 19th century, and which became a part of the written tradition. Melodies of the short melodies were collected in octoikos, which was, as it can be assumed, the elementary chanting book for beginners. The great chant was notated in the collections under the same title by a large number of Serbian scribes. According to existing collections in recent Serbian chanting tradition, mainly hymns are chanted in liturgy. Cherubic and communion hymns is truly meet, and rare chants for vespers and matins or special occasions, such as "O joyful light," it is truly meet at the bishop's entrance, and the King of Heaven at the wasting of the bishop on the spot, and so on, belong to the great chanting. Serbian chanters and scribes did not make a difference between certain melodies within this more advanced melodic genre. However, they hardly had a reason for that, because those melodies did not differ significantly from each other. Namely, hymns with different textual alignment, but which belong to the same mode, often have identical basic melodies. Please, the next slide, the two next slides. Yes, it's the melody of great chant, and it is communion hymn to the angels, but the same melody, without any difference, is written with text for hymn is truly meet, communion hymn, praise the Lord, and so on. The structure of these melodies is formed by long melodic patterns, also arranged according to a certain sequence. Thus, this apparently freer melodic form is qualified by the same rules equally characteristic of the syllabic melodies. This is the direct consequence of learning by heart entire melodic patterns based on established sequence regardless of their length. In other words, the process of tailoring, which is supposed to presume creative attitude to reshaping the standard melody in accordance to a new textual alignment, was omitted even in melismatic melodies, where the possibilities of variable work with melodic patterns are much greater than in those melodies with a syllabic rhythmical metric structure. Fortunately, the number of young people today in Serbia who show strong interest and responsible approach to the art of chanting has been increasingly recently. Apart from numerous chanting seminaries traditionally organized in various Serbian monasteries, which cherish monophonic and part church singing, There are several choirs whose performance is based on the research of pneumatic chanting tradition of the 19th century, which has been preserved in music manuscripts, mainly at Hilandar, the Serbian monastery on Mount Athos. Most importantly, the completion of theoretical knowledge regarding the octo ecosystem, its melodic, scale-wise, rhythmical, and other features, as well as getting to know both the rich music literature of the Hilandar chanting treasury and chanting tradition of the other Orthodox nations, will enable the Serbian chanters to understand traditional melodic patterns in the following way. Instead of understanding them as unchangeable stereotypes, they can see them as potential material which gets enriched always and again in accordance with a given liturgical text. It was my paper today. Thank you for attention.
I would like, Sara, to ask you to explain us, please, this very interesting thing with writing the text and the syllables without music. So it seems that music memory was functioning at a very, very high level in those older times. So they just repeated the vowels in order to support some, we can guess, very melismatic melodic flow. And they knew it by heart. But maybe this by heart, knowing by heart and singing by heart is something very elastic, as you showed us also with the beautiful analysis.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure that it was not so strict, and I'm sure that it's not possible to know by heart melismatic hymn without any difference. Yes, but in the situation when chanter didn't know new notation and didn't know how to written down the melody that he learned from his daskalos, from his teacher. It was the only way to memorize the melody, repeating it many times, and then just to repeat syllables and parts of word, and to try to remember what was those embellishments that his teacher used to sing. So those manuscripts are very interesting, and there are many of them in Serbian monastery libraries, which means that unfortunately Serbian chanters in the 18th century were musically illiterate, but with all those Greek teachers who came who came from Mount Athos and other parts of in that time there was no Greek country, but they were Greek by origin. It was I can say probably the late Byzantine music tradition, with also melismatic as well, and shortened melodic versions, and Serbian chanters who were talented and who had good music memory. They just tried to simulate, to improvise the melismatic chants in that way.
This is very, very interesting, and I wanted to ask you also whether there is any testimony from Serbian chanting about hieronomy, because hieronomy would help a lot in this process of singing by heart. And singing by heart for us today means something quite different from what it meant in Middle Ages and in late Middle Ages and then in post-Byzantine times also, that it's not this reproducing faithfully every single note. It's something quite different.
Yes. Well, it is not related directly with this period that I tried to present you today, but I wrote a book about our music testimonies and manuscripts from the 15th century. And one chapter of my book is about presentation on fresco paintings about Hieronymi. And as you especially know, there was a very famous book of I've just forget the name of. Remind me, please. Yes, Neil Moran, yes. It is something that we have to mention in Serbian monasteries from 13th to 15th century. There are very often fresco paintings with chanters and with Hieronymi. What does it mean? Is it possible that Serbian chanters didn't know to chant, or is it just some stereotypes between other zoographic themes? I'm sure that it couldn't be the truth. Well, those fresco paintings are stated almost in pulpit space, so they just show that this space is dedicated to chanters. So it was not just a topic of a zoographic manner, but it is something that illustrate the chanting practice in that time. So I'm sure that in that golden age of Serbian history, when we had saint kings who were dedicated to spiritual life very well, and became saints from the saint dynasty of Nemanjić, they tried to have everything that we could find in Constantinople or in other centers of Byzantine Empire. So from recent history, we don't have, unfortunately, any record, any testimony of Hieronymi in those manuscripts. But if we go a little bit in history from the Middle Ages, those zoographic themes are for sure true.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this. If I may just supply an information from Evangelia Spiracu, which researches, she researches now in depth all the extant sources and also oral traditions about ways of performing, as described also in Old Tipica for the great church of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, but also with the old believers, Staroveri.
Staroverci, da.
This is a very, very important tradition, because she said, I can't believe it. I see it with my eyes, what is described in Tipica of the 10th century. It's a tradition which has survived. And this is a very, very important fact. So it was a reality, and also the whole congregation sing, also the women, the children, and you can see it. They are on YouTube. They have these old believers also from Ukraine, but there are also in Romania, some of them, and in Russia, of course. And they keep some old traditions which are very important for us as researchers to see how what you see depicted in all the old frescoes of our churches in the Balkans is really a life situation or at this Staroveri, these old believers. So I think many things we can learn in the future, many things from all this interaction between orality and written text. And also we will not underestimate the role of memory and the power of memory.
Of course. Well, today with new technologies, our memory is more poor than in old times. So I'm sure that they used to be free of all those boundaries, you know. So
yeah. So then, thank you so much, and again, congratulations for this brilliant paper, dear Sara.
Thank you, and thank you to Abbott who invited me to take part. And sorry for my late today. In Serbia, it is 1 hour. It's not the same time zone, so yes.
Thank you so much.